Daniels just went through the metal detectors. We expect this court hearing on client-attorney privilege and the President of the United States. That's what's at stake for him. I'm Harris. Here's Dana.
Fox News Alert, a major court hearing about to begin where President Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, is asking a judge to block prosecutors from access to some material seized in those FBI raids. Cohen claiming the files contain privileged attorney-client communications. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Daily Briefing. Former adult film actress Stormy Daniels arriving in court just minutes ago. Her lawyer says these proceedings could cause problems for the president and his attorney.
What's going to happen with Michael Cohen? I think Michael Cohen's in a lot of trouble. I think any recordings that Michael Cohen made without people's permission is a big, big problem for Michael Cohen and possibly the president of the United States.
We have Fox team coverage. Former Justice Department prosecutor James Trusty with analysis. But we begin with Laura Ingle at the courthouse. Laura.
Hi, Dana. Well, it's all happened. Everybody is here, and the court proceedings set to start any moment now. Lawyers for the president, his personal attorney, who is now here, and as you mentioned, Stormy Daniels, they'll all be under the same roof to take part and witness and be a part of, as they're asked, of today's legal proceedings that go inside what happened with that raid with Cohen's documents that were seized earlier last week. As we take you through some of the video that we've shot today of people showing up, the federal judge in the case, Kimba Wood, ordered Cohen to appear in person today, as well as turn over a list of names of his legal clients after his lawyers couldn't answer questions about who they were last week. Earlier this morning, Cohen's team named those names, listing President Trump, GOP fundraiser Elliot Broidy, and a third person who asked not to be identified in today's court filing. Those are 3 legal clients he was able to provide. Now, both Cohen and lawyers for President Trump asked the judge if their teams could review the seized evidence before prosecutors do, so their attorneys could protect any privileged information. Mr. Trump's lawyers filing paperwork late last night asking the judge to help them safeguard the president's sacred right to attorney-client privilege. But earlier this morning, Cohen seemed to change his tune and tweaked his request to ask for a third party, or what's known as a special master, to be appointed by the court to review the record seized. Mr. Trump's team has not changed their request as far as we know. However, the U.S. Attorney's Office has responded to Mr. Trump's legal team filing, submitting a letter to the court which says that the proposal offered by Trump's legal team that they would be the first to screen those documents for attorney-client privilege would set a dangerous precedent. And they closed out that letter, Dana, by saying such a rule is unworkable and ripe for abuse. Court proceedings underway at this hour. Back to you.
Laura, thank you. The lawyer for Stormy Daniels, who claims an affair with the president, led to the non-disclosure agreement at the heart of this matter. Her lawyers, Michael Avenatti, had some advice for Michael Cohen on his way in the courtroom today.
Should Michael Cohen be representing himself?
There's an old saying that any attorney that represents himself has a fool for a client. I think that would certainly be true in this instance, no doubt.
Does Michael Cohen have anything to be afraid of if he has recordings, if the judge has recordings of him and you or your client, or something to do with your case?
Well, I don't know that the judge would have any such recordings, but if Michael Cohen was making any recordings of anyone without their permission, I think that could pose a serious problem for Michael Cohen.
Let's bring in James Trusty, a former DOJ prosecutor. Wanted to have you listen to Trey Gowdy, the congressman from South Carolina, about this raid on Michael Cohen's offices. Take a listen.
Sure. We know that it requires the highest levels of DOJ permission to seize attorney-client records. And by that, I mean the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General. And we also know it must have nothing to do with Bob Mueller's probe, either directly or indirectly, or he would not have referred it.
Also, James, if I could run through this with you, former prosecutor Andrew McCarthy, who has written a lot about this case for National Review, writes, clearly the prosecutors regard Trump and Cohen as potential co-conspirators. It is important to bear in mind a distinction from the Russia investigation. This is not a counterintelligence matter. The SDNY is unquestionably conducting a criminal investigation, and a federal judge would not have authorized search warrants absent finding probable cause that federal crimes may have been committed. Wanted to get your take, James, on how unusual is this hearing that's being held just a few blocks away from our studios?
Yeah, the hearing is very unusual. Most of the time, if you're going to be challenging a search warrant, it's going to happen after you've been criminally charged and you file pretrial motions that allow for all sorts of constitutional challenges or other challenges to the case. So they were able to get the judge's attention, which is pretty impressive in terms of filing this show cause motion. But whether they're going to actually succeed in creating a new process for the review of potentially privileged materials, I think is unlikely.
Can you walk us through this issue of the filter teams, also known as clean teams or taint teams? What is that all about and how does it work?
Sure. Well, a filter team is basically just a process that's set up by the investigators, by the trial team of prosecutors, and by their agents to essentially safeguard themselves from any recusal. They send the materials to neutral folks that have nothing to do with the case. Those people review it to determine whether there might be privileged materials, and they will then kind of shepherd that to a judge for permission slips to either use or not use. So the point of all that is to keep the trial team from getting to a position where they've looked at something that's privileged and they get kicked off their own case. It's a pretty well-established process for DOJ. It's not really a constitutional requirement, but it's been something that has been used in practice for many years, and it's been approved of by courts in New York frequently.
And then you talked about, when we spoke earlier today, that you see some daylight starting to happen between Mueller's investigation and the rest of this. Can you explain?
Well, I think there's an interesting issue. You know, Paul Manafort filed a motion to basically challenge the scope of the independent counsel, and I thought that was a fairly routine motion and one that wasn't really going to win. But I think there's a bit of an evolving issue, which is whether or not there's too much closeness. If the independent counsel team is making referrals, which is, again, is based on the limits to the scope of their investigation, but still really participating or at least obtaining information that helps them build their own case. So it may be that SDNY and the independent counsel have completely separated once the referral was made. But if I were in the mix representing Mr. Cohen, I'd sure be exploring whether or not SDNY is basically a bit of a stalking horse for the team Mueller and obtaining information that goes back to the Mueller team.
That's certainly a question. Laura Ingle, in her report, said that Michael Cohen today was asked by the judge to give a list of clients, and Michael Cohen provided 2 of 3, President Trump and Elliot Broidy. The third one wants to remain anonymous. Is that in Michael Cohen's best interest, and is it sustainable?
Probably not in his best interest, and because it's fairly new territory, I don't want to say it's completely unsustainable. I mean, the reality is what the judge, I think, is doing is assessing the scope of how much material is going to be out there, but also letting the filter team or whoever it's going to be that does it understand their search terms, understand what is it that they're looking for that might trigger a claim of privilege. So if you leave out a client's name, then there's a much greater chance that the filter team will recover and review materials that might have otherwise been privileged. So it's a little bit against his interest not to identify the person, but I imagine he's got some sort of
probably
real
has a good reason to try to. Our last question, we don't have that much time, but I did want to ask you, everyone's talking about James Comey's book. He's also a potential witness in the Mueller investigation. Do you think, from your experience, that James Comey might have, tampered his own witness shield in providing this book?
Well, I'll put it this way. I don't think any prosecutor wants to put a witness on the stand that publishes a book about their testimony. There's room for problems from that, just from that very fact. But in the grand scheme of things, and this is probably a little bit of a naive or romantic notion by me, I would kind of hope that FBI directors wouldn't typically want to do kiss and tell books. So no matter what the president said or did, no matter what Comey's feelings of being a victim or not, the idea that a law enforcement person at that high level writes these types of books is a little bit disturbing to me. So I don't know if that's direct to credibility, but it's certainly a factor in terms of assessing him. That said, I don't think there's going to be an obstruction case that relies on Mr. Comey to be a star witness anyway.
All right. Well, we love having you on the show. Thanks, James Trusty. We'll be back in touch.
Thanks, Dana.
So it's midterm Monday, and a brand new poll shows the Democratic lead is shrinking. So do predictions of a blue wave still hold? Plus, the White House trying to get back on track as James Comey and Michael Cohen dominate the headlines. Chris Stirewalt weighs in next.
See, the president has constitutional protections for what he did as president. He has far fewer protections for what he did as a business person. There's no evidence he did anything wrong, but that's where his vulnerabilities lie.
In multiple fires as it tries to regain its footing after James Comey's explosive interview ahead of the release of his new book and the ongoing legal saga of President Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen. Chris Starwalt is Fox News politics editor and editor of Halftime Report. So I have a theory. Can I run it by you? I really feel like James Comey's book is not making a lot of news. There wasn't a lot of new things in it. And I think it's going to sort of like dissipate. I don't think it's going to have the big shock effect that James Comey thought it would. Am I wrong?
Well, I think this is more than anything, you get down to it, it's a partisan litmus test. You hear the screechy, freaky wailing from Republican precincts attacking James Comey as the devil himself. And then you will hear from members of the hashtag resistance that James Comey is a powerful truth teller, honest as he is tall, and a magnificent specimen of American excellence.
Right. And it took James Comey to bring Republicans and Democrats together. Amazing.
Yes. And in the end, it's sort of like, who cares? Because we're going to have to wait and see what Mueller does. Comey and Trump phrasing and couching and attacking each other in this way doesn't really get us any closer to the truth, doesn't really add anything to it. It's just sort of partisan posturing. So it's like, meh.
Well, then let me move on then, since we think that it's meh. There was something pretty interesting today. You and I have talked about midterm Mondays every week, and the congressional ballot, the generic ballot, had shown that Republicans were really in dire straits, but that has shrunk considerably. Democrats now at 47%, Republicans at 43%. So the Democratic lead has shrunk considerably.
So that's is that the Washington Post poll, or is that the Wall Street Journal poll?
I don't know. I just wrote it down with my pen.
your high-tech pen. Either way, they're all saying the same thing, and they're in keeping with what our polls have said.
So why did you even bother asking me that?
Well, because here's why. When we look at other polls that come to similar conclusions, I like the Quinnipiac poll because, of course, they provide data about subgroups so that we can look at that. Republican and Democratic relative enthusiasm or relative support inside these spaces have remained about the same. But an interesting thing has happened. Independents' preference for a Democratic Congress has dropped 8 points in 2 months.
Is that because of tax cuts, tax reform, and the generally pretty good economy?
Well, there is all of that, but there is also this, which is what is the point of them? What do Democrats want to do? What would they do if they get the Congress back? And of course, Republicans are out there every day saying all they want to do is impeach, impeach, impeach. Democrats are not going to be able to get through this midterm cycle without a message. Look, it's enough for them to hang together as a party around the precept of they hate Donald Trump. But it's not going to be enough to get the independent voters that they need, not only to vote for them, but to get out and vote in the first place. So they're going to have to come up with something that it looks like a contract with voters, something that looks like a plan in order to prevent that slippage at the margins. And
I also saw that Republican voter registration is up.
And in some places and Democratic in other places. What midterm elections generally are battles between the bases of the two parties, and decent people tend to excuse themselves from the process because it gets so ugly so early, it becomes so awful. And so that's why registration numbers count for so much, because that is a good reflection of enthusiasm and organization.
In the meantime, the president, of course, is trying to manage our involvement in Syria. And there's questions coming from both Republicans and Democrats, members of Congress and senators, who are wondering what sort of approval that the president's going to ask for, if any, from Congress. Senator Mike Lee just said this: while the president has the authority under the War Powers Act to respond when the U.S. is under attack or in imminent danger, such circumstances did not exist with regard to Syria. Promoting regional stability, mitigating humanitarian catastrophe, and deterring the use of chemical weapons might be important foreign policy goals, but if they are to be pursued with military force, a president must first seek congressional authorization. Well, number one, the president did not seek authorization. Number two, I think that if you saw UN Ambassador Nikki Haley yesterday, she said, if we're not careful, chemical weapons could end up hurting us here at home as well.
Well, I don't know that that's going to feed the bulldog, but what the White House can count on, no matter what, is that Congress hates to do its job. My God, does Congress hate to do its job. They will do anything other than do their job. Mike Lee is part of a tiny, tiny minority of members of Congress who wish to fulfill and execute their constitutional duty on these questions. What this president, like his predecessors, can count on is the fact that Congress rolls over quicker on hard questions than anything else. They will fight you all day long over naming a post office, but when it comes to lighten up the tomahawks, they are not to be found.
Okay.
Do not disturb.
Right. All right, Chris Stirewalt, thank you. Happy Monday.
Happy Monday.
President Trump saying every missile hit its target in Syria. Could more airstrikes be on the way? Plus, action in the United Nations on Syria, what we've learned about plans for a new resolution.
The U.S., the U.K., and France all standing together. You've heard a chorus of countries coming out in support of the actions that the U.S. and her allies took. I think Russia's taking notice of that.
Out from U.S.-led airstrikes in Syria. President Trump saying every missile hit its target amid warnings that more could be on the way. All this as the U.S. gets ready to hit Russia with new economic sanctions for enabling the Assad regime in its use of chemical weapons. We have Team Fox coverage with Eric Shawn live at the United Nations, but we start with David Lee Miller on the Israel-Syria border in the Golan Heights. David Lee.
Dana, it's 9:20 in the evening now. You can see now the border is dark. Off in the distance over my shoulder, you can see the lights of a UN compound. Beyond that, there are Syrian villages. They are shrouded in complete darkness. These villages, many of them, are now in the hands of rebels. That might soon change. Many feel now that Bashar al-Assad may be emboldened by the recent U.S. airstrikes and may try and retake these villages. Meanwhile, earlier today in the Syrian capital of Damascus, hundreds of people took to the streets to take part in a mass demonstration of support for the regime. The demonstration was broadcast live on state television. There was celebratory gunfire as people shouted, "Allah, Syria, and only Bashar." This event was called a salute to the Syrian army. Meanwhile, tension in the region continues to escalate because of another growing conflict, this one between Iran and Israel. The escalation began 2 months ago when Israel shot down a drone it says was launched by Iranians from a Syrian airbase. Israel has now admitted for the first time that it was behind a retaliatory strike hitting that base last week. The Israeli attack killed 7 Iranians, including a colonel. And Iran is now threatening, quote, that Israel's crime will not go unpunished. And Israel, after examining that drone's remnants and the flight path, is claiming that drone was not on a reconnaissance mission, as was first thought, but was actually carrying explosives. It was an explosive-laden drone. So now we have these two countries in the Middle East, Israel and Iran, no longer threatening each other with proxies, but in a direct conflict that many here fear could engulf the entire region. Dana?
David Lee Miller, important report. Thank you. So Fox News alert, our Syria coverage continues. 3 Western allies launching a bid at the United Nations to investigate the Assad regime's chemical weapons. The U.S., Britain, and France circulating a UN draft resolution. The move signaling a return to diplomacy after the U.S.-led missile strikes on Syrian chemical weapons sites. Eric Shawn is live at the UN. Eric.
Hi, Dana. Well, the chemical weapons inspectors happen to be stuck in Damascus while a dispute has broken out here at the United Nations. Russia is saying that there are security problems over there in the city of Duma, where that was the site of the alleged attack. But a spokesman for the Secretary General here at the UN said that is not the case, that they have given all proper clearances to the team to go to Duma. But bottom line, they are not there, but a team of media members have been escorted to the site by the Syrian government, but the inspectors are not. Meanwhile, the Security Council diplomats are considering a new resolution that would not just deal with the chemical issue, but a political settlement of the civil war. Diplomats really putting the pressure on Russia because of their continued support of Bashar al-Assad. Some observers wondering if the delays are all part of a plan to try and hide any evidence that the Syrians have denied.
We will start the discussion later today in good faith, in a good spirit with the 15 members. The goal of this resolution is clear. It is for the Security Council to restart a collective action to deal with the chemical dossier, to protect the civilian populations, and to work toward a political settlement of the Syrian crisis.
And there are harsh words from Moscow from British Ambassador Karen Pierce in an exclusive interview with me on Fox News Channel, the first interview of her as an ambassador by an American television network. She called on Russia to rejoin the international community and to bring Assad to the negotiating table. Ambassador Pierce also told me that Russia is acting like a, quote, rogue country.
We find it astounding, as do many people, that a country that helped build the Chemical Weapons Convention and the global non-proliferation regime, that Russia can now be one of those rogue countries that are looking to undo it.
Do you feel that Russia, as you say, is a rogue country?
I think it has those tendencies.
Well, Ambassador Pierce also said it is up to Russia as well as Iran to change Assad's mind and to try and start the peace talks. Dana, back to you.
So, Eric, in listening to the ambassador from the UK, I'm curious how the United States and our allies at the UN are dealing with the fact that Russia is spreading so much disinformation, not only in regards over the past few years, but about these actual attacks. I mean, are they united in trying to deal with that?
Yes, they are. In fact, in my interview yesterday, I did ask her about that, and she said simply that it is, in her words, 1984, that this is disinformation, it is continual denials that have no basis in any truth. She has pointed out that the Chemical Weapons Organization has confirmed, for example, the attack by the nerve agent in her country, in England, on that ex-Russian spy and his daughter, confirmed that that was a nerve agent that is from the Russian military, despite Moscow's denials. They certainly are pointing everything they have on Russia to try and move its way, as she says, back into the international community and part of the responsibilities as a permanent member of the Security Council.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, Eric Shawn, thank you. James Comey lets loose in a sit-down interview about his book, calling for ethical leadership, but does he live up to that? Meanwhile, President Trump on the road, talking tax cuts. We're live in Florida.
This could be one of the greatest booms ever. I think it will be, actually, because the companies are so strong and they're ready to rock.
Tax Day giving President Trump a chance to tout his biggest legislative achievement. The president holding a roundtable in Florida, saying Americans will be paying less money to Uncle Sam.
Tomorrow, last day, very importantly, next year it's going to be a simple, for the most part, one page. It may get a little bit bigger, but it'll be simple and easy to do. And very importantly, you're going to have a lot of money left over from what you have.
Phil Keating is live in Hialeah, Florida. Phil.
Hey, Trump's USA Open for Business roundtable in Cuban-American-rich Miami metro area wrapping up not too long ago. And unlike the president's last business leaders roundtable to talk about tax cuts in West Virginia, where President Trump went off script, actually talking very little about business impact of the tax cut package, today the event stayed far more focused with some local Made in Miami stories as well. About 400 people stood up and cheered President Trump loudly as he entered the room, smiling and waving back at the crowd. And when Trump introduced his new national security advisor and former Fox News contributor John Bolton, the crowd gave him a huge ovation as well, preceding the president hailing the weekend's missile strikes on Syria a huge success. But the president quickly returned to the economy.
3 million new jobs, unemployment rates for Hispanics. Are there any Hispanics in the room? No, I don't. For Hispanics, we have the lowest level ever recorded.
6 business leaders from the metro area were invited to join the president on stage with his secretaries of labor and the treasury, as well as Senator Marco Rubio and Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, also 2 crowd favorites. And as designed by the White House, the business leaders hailed Trump's $1.5 trillion tax cut package, his signature legislative achievement.
I've been able to invest in newer technology, been able to buy more equipment, and hire more employees for my business.
Our hourly employees have seen an approximate wage increase of about 20% in this short time period. People are earning more, and therefore, this gives them confidence to go out and spend more. A win-win for everyone.
There was definitely a love fest here inside this gymnasium at the Bucky Dent Park in Hialeah, Florida, which has the largest concentration of Cuban Americans in the country. From here, Trump went back to the airport in Miami. He's now on Air Force One, soon to land in West Palm Beach, where he will then join at the top of the hour First Lady Melania at Mar-a-Lago for the rest of the week. Dana?
All right, Phil, thank you. James Comey sparking a media frenzy as he promotes his book, A Higher Loyalty. But my next guest writing in his book review, it's hard for Comey to make hard news with this book. The territory has been so well covered by copious reporting on his memos and his congressional testimony. Carlos Lozada is the nonfiction book critic for The Washington Post. I read him every week, and it's a great thing to have you on the show because you've actually read the book. A lot of people are just commenting on the book since it comes out tomorrow. And I wanted to ask you, who do you think James Comey wrote this book for?
That's a good question. Thanks, Dana. I think James Comey sort of wrote it for himself. You see him working through a lot of issues and questions and sort of second-guessing himself on matters big and small, but kind of coming out saying, like, yeah, I think I pretty much did it right the first time. You know, this is not just a Washington tell-all. You know, this is a real memoir. Comey writes about his childhood, writes about, some really interesting, episodes he had growing up. And you don't really hear much about Trump or Hillary Clinton till fairly deep into the book. But I think it's reflective, and I think he's trying to work through things for himself.
You also write that that it was sort of a geek chorus, which I thought was a great phrase. And you ask a question: does Comey live up to the standards of ethics and leadership that he outlines in this book? And what was your conclusion?
Well, he talks a lot about ethical leadership, which is this concept he's really focused on, and that includes values of transparency and humility and loyalty to truth over personal gain. At the same time, he confesses that he's very aware that he can be overconfident and stubborn and prideful. And so you see moments when he is attempting to live up to those standards of ethical leadership, but he doesn't necessarily always get there. When he came out and spoke about Hillary Clinton's emails and spoke very aggressively, he looks back and wonders if maybe the reason I spoke out in this way and announced that I was reopening the investigation late in the year, right before the election, was because I was thinking politically, and I was thinking she's probably going to be the president. I mean, look at the polls, and I don't want it to be said later that it's an illegitimate presidency because she was still under investigation. And yet he prides himself so much on being apolitical, on not thinking about the political consequences or certainly not polling data. And so there's something of a contradiction there. He also speaks out in sort of vague and harsh terms on his former boss, Loretta Lynch, the former Attorney General, and suggests that there was some hazy intel that suggested that maybe she could have been compromised. I don't think so, but it was there, and so that's why I felt I had to speak out independent of her when he came out in the summer of 2016. Another
one of your great lines in the review was that Comey isn't just the kind of writer who quotes Shakespeare, but the kind who quotes himself quoting Shakespeare. He rejects the notion that I am in love with my own righteousness, yet notes that I have long worried about my ego. And one of those things about Washington is that if you want a friend, get a dog. But truly in Washington right now, James Comey might actually find himself with not a lot of friends because the Republicans are mad at him, the Democrats are mad at him, and it could be kind of quiet if he has a D.C. book party.
I think Comey is sort of this almost perfect character for this moment. When we look back on this really divisive period in American politics and American history, he crystallizes that. You know, he is not loved by any side of these passionate battles, and in some ways, Comey himself and the resonance of this book capture that.
All right, Carlos Lozada, I'm glad you could be on the show today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
New drama surrounding the Speaker of the House and the man who wants to replace him, why they disagree on when Paul Ryan should give up his post.
I think it's important that Republicans be unified as we head into the midterms with respect to that. But again, our focus needs to be on making sure that the next speaker is a Republican.
Fox News deck, President Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, in court right now. And so is Stormy Daniels and her lawyer. Cohen admits that he paid the adult film star $130,000 to protect the president, to buy silence. Cohen and his lawyer are trying to convince a judge to let them decide which items from last week's FBI raid should be kept secret because lots of questions about what they got. And the lawyer for President Trump says the president himself should get a look at the evidence. I'll speak with an attorney who can look at both sides. He says that the president does not have a right to see anything that the feds took. He'll explain why, and we'll have the latest from today's hearing. Top of the hour on Shepard Smith reporting. See you then.
Midterm Monday and an ABC News Washington Post poll showing Dems ahead of the GOP 47 to 43%, but their lead is shrinking, dropping from 12 points in January to 4 points now. While an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll shows registered voters prefer a Democratic-controlled Congress to a GOP-controlled one, 47 to 40%. Joining me now, Mo Elleithee, the executive director of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Policy and a Fox News contributor, and Matt Schlapp, chairman of the American Conservative Union. All right, gentlemen, this generic ballot is bounced around a little bit, but that giant lead that the Republicans were looking at the Democrats having has been shrinking, Mo. And is that possibly because the Democrats have found it hard to get off of the impeachment talk and onto something having to do with policy?
I'm not sure that's the issue. There are a couple out there that are talking about impeachment, and I wish they would stop. But for the most part, most Democrats aren't doing that. Now, I think Democrats do need to focus a little bit more on sort of the positive message. And these polls are going to continue to bump around. But one thing we have seen that has been fairly consistent from the beginning of this election cycle has been a tremendous amount of energy on the ground, where in all these special elections, Democrats are outperforming their typical performance by 20-plus points and coming very close or winning in districts they have no business in. So I think the wind's still at their back, but they can't take this for granted. Democrats are going to still have to make a full-on contrast here.
And Matt, the Republicans have shown an uptick in registration, which, of course, in a midterm election year for a president and a Congress and having the majorities, that's obviously very important. You got to go out there and try to find those voters. And it's coming at a time when the speakership is also in question on the Republican side. And I wonder how you think that those two issues might coincide, at least either help Republicans, or could it hurt them if they don't figure this out sooner than later?
Yeah, Dana, my view, first of all, the Democrats seem to turn to a positive agenda. I'd like to see just like one plank in that platform. I haven't heard anything positive for a year and a half. And I think that's one of the reasons these polls are narrowing. And as far as the speakership for the Republicans is concerned, I don't think Paul Ryan's retirement will have any impact. I think the drama you see on the Hill is Republicans who are worried about, does their close friend become the next speaker, and who is that next speaker? But I think the rest of America isn't very concerned about that at all. They want to make sure is that Republicans are focused on the right things. A big leadership race right now would be sending all the wrong signals. Republicans should be focused on doing everything they can to make American lives better. And that includes building off the successful tax reform and tax cut plan, the stopping of regulations, and making sure they do everything possible to give the American people economic prosperity. If they feel better economically, we're going to do just fine.
Yeah, and it's, for the Democrats, they've got to figure out what's going on. But in the meantime, 2020, it feels like it's way far in the future, but actually Politico today saying that Joe Biden is actually on top for Democrats at this point, saying that the bigger issue is whether there's a place for him atop the Democratic Party that's taken shape after the ruinous 2016 election cycle. This new iteration is unsentimental and unforgiving, and Biden has more than a few conspicuous Senate votes that demand a reckoning in the Trump-era Democratic Party. Mo, I know you give a lot of thought to this. And I know it's too early to talk about who the nominee will be, but just in terms of the type of Democrat that might actually emerge after these midterms that would want to challenge President Trump, what are your thoughts about Joe Biden?
So I think this raises such an interesting question for Democrats, and post midterm is going to be a huge moment of reflection for them. If Democrats turn the nomination battle to a battle between left and center left, they will have learned the wrong lessons from 2016, just as if Republicans make any nomination battle about right versus center right. The real divide now is between up and down. It's between elites and masses. It is a populist moment. And so they need to be articulating the candidate who wins is going to be the one that can be the best champion. Joe Biden can articulate that. We'll see who else emerges on the scene as well.
Matt, I only have 20 seconds. Can you tell me your thoughts on Joe Biden? Does that worry you at all from the Republican standpoint?
Yeah, I agree with Mo a bit, but I also do think on the left that the Democratic Party has become, is in the stranglehold of radical leftists, and Joe Biden is a much more moderate character. I think he could give the president a run for his money, but I just can't imagine the left-leaning Democratic Party will give him that chance.
We'll give him the chance?
Yeah.
Very interesting. All right, Mo Alethi and Matt Schlapp, thank you on this midterm Monday. Near freezing temperatures at the Boston Marathon didn't stop one runner from doing something that has not been done in over 30 years. Plus, she was the wife and is a mother of President. Now, a much admired First Lady is in failing health. An update on her condition. 122nd Boston Marathon had to battle more than the 26.2 miles. Driving rain led to one of the slowest races in years. Japan's Yuki Kawauchi won the men's race in just under 2 hours and 16 minutes. And on the women's side, California's Desiree Linden became the first American woman to win the race since 1985, doing it in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Today's race came 5 years and a day after terrorist homemade bombs exploded near the finish line, killing 3 people. Former First Lady Barbara Bush is in failing health. A family spokesman says Mrs. Bush will not seek additional medical treatment after a series of recent hospitalizations. The 92-year-old wife of former President George H.W. Bush will instead focus on comfort care at home. Casey Stiegel is live in Houston. Casey.
Dana, I know that she holds a very special place in your heart, and she is beloved around the world, really. A family spokesperson says that Mrs. Bush made this tough decision after consulting her family doctors and also her own family after being in and out of the hospital, like you said. So now it's more about keeping former First Lady comfortable and out of pain. The 92-year-old Bush family matriarch has suffered from Graves' disease, a thyroid condition, also congestive heart failure, and a pulmonary disease known as COPD. Jenna Bush Hager, of course, President George W. Bush's daughter, fighting back tears on the Today Show, talking about her grandmother. Listen.
We are grateful for her. She's the best grandma anybody could have ever had or have. And Barbara and I talked to her last night. She's in great spirits and she's a fighter. She's an enforcer. She reminded me not to believe everything you read. And so we're grateful for her, for everybody's prayers and thoughts.
She and that famous white hair and the pearls, Dana, really an icon. And as you know, she and Bush 41 just celebrated 73 years wedding anniversary. So thoughts and prayers are certainly with the family.
Absolutely, indeed. There's so many stories that touch all of us. Thank you, Casey, for that.
Gosh, I can't imagine.
Coming up, we will check in with the newest member of the Daily Briefing team as he learns the ropes at Fox from a new friend.